You're listening to the Monday Night Community Show with Daniel on BRFM.
So we are out and about, and we're at the Sheerness Dockyard, and we're joined with Will Palin. We're going to be talking all about the Dockyard Church. But firstly, Will, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us, and it's good to see you after a couple of years since Promenade.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to see you again, Daniel, and it's good to meet up with more positive news.
Well, I was going to say that you must be very pleased with the news at the moment on the Dockyard Church.
Yeah, it's been a long struggle, and it's just really satisfying to finally have got that church into the right hands, so we can begin what will be a long and slow process of bringing that building back to life.
Well, it's a pretty amazing building, so I was wondering if you could give our listeners kind of an introduction into the history of it.
Sure. The Dockyard Church, and just so your listeners, I'm sure they'll all know what building we're talking about, but it's the building which sits next to that elegant terrace of houses, Naval Terrace at Sheerness Dockyard, just outside the dockyard. And it's been a ruin, effectively, for about 12 years since a fire in 2001. It was built as part of the brand new dockyard in the 1820s, which cost over £1 million as a building project. And the church was just one part of this huge complex, and it was to serve, obviously, the officers of the dockyard. And it was designed by the Admiralty architect of the time, who was a man called George Ledwell Taylor. Now, he's interesting, and some of your listeners may know Hadlow Tower, not a million miles from here in Kent, on the way to Tunbridge Wells, which is a mad, fanciful Gothic tower based on a famous tower built by William Beckford at a place called Fonthill in Wiltshire. And that was also designed by George Ledwell Taylor. So as well as these big, austere classical buildings such as Dockyard Church, he was also capable of designing some quite extraordinary Gothic buildings such as the tower at Hadlow.
Now, I know there's going to be some different groups involved in restoring the church. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a bit more about those.
Sure. We want to bring everyone together on this project, locally and nationally, in the sense of all the big heritage groups, because it's only through teamwork that we're going to achieve the restoration of this building. But there are several prime movers at the moment. The council, Swale Borough Council, who have very bravely and heroically compulsory purchased this building, have agreed what's called a back-to-back agreement with a trust called the Spitalfields Historic Buildings Trust. So the building has been handed over to the Spitalfields Trust for the time being. The trust will undertake some emergency stabilisation works just to make sure there's no further deterioration of the fabric. And then the building will be passed on to a new trust, which we're in the process of setting up, which will be a building preservation trust dedicated just to the Dockyard Church. And we've already been in discussions with the big grant funding bodies such as the Heritage Lottery Fund. English Heritage have been hugely supportive, and they all seem very keen in principle to help. It's going to be an expensive project, but there are groups out there such as the HLF who are prepared to fund large schemes such as this. So we're excited to be moving on to the next stage. And of course, the key thing is we want to involve everyone locally in the campaign to get that building back together. And I think the first thing we'll do, now we own the building, is have another public meeting. We had a public meeting a year and a half ago when we were looking into options for reuse of the building, and that was very successful. We held that at the Sheppey Little Theatre. So we'll be having another meeting to partly to communicate to everyone what's going on, but also to get people's ideas and feedback on what they want that building to be.
We are at the moment out and about, and we're talking to Will Palin. We're talking all about the Dockyard Church in the Dockyard in Sheerness. So we are out and about, and we're at the Sheerness Dockyard, and we're talking all about the Dockyard Church with Will Palin. And you mentioned the Spitalfields Trust, and I've heard about it before, and probably our listeners have as well. So I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about that.
Of course, and your listeners, I'm sure, will be sort of some of them thinking, what is Spitalfields? Where is Spitalfields? What is this trust? Well, the Spitalfields Trust was formed in London in the 1970s in an area called Spitalfields, which is a historic area just east of the City of London, where there were lots of beautiful early Georgian houses which were in a terrible state of disrepair. And the trust began squatting these buildings, preventing demolition, and then eventually buying them up or acquiring them very cheaply and restoring them and selling them on with protective covenants. And they've restored about 60 buildings in this area of London over its history. The trust, eventually it became too expensive to buy even derelict buildings in London, so they began to be looking at projects elsewhere. And it was then that they discovered, or rather were directed towards Shirland Hall in Eastchurch on the Isle of Sheppey, a spectacular Tudor gatehouse in a terrible state. And they took on the building. Everyone said they were mad, and they undertook a loving restoration project. And the building is now beautifully restored and has now been sold on for private use. It was whilst they were doing that project, they also discovered Sheerness Dockyard, and they fronted a consortium of owners in a buyout of the residential quarter in the Dockyard, about 11 listed buildings, most of which have been empty for about 10 years. And that project is now well underway. So they've got a good track record, and the next big challenge is the church. But as I said, the trust are really just acting as a facilitator to work with the council over the compulsory purchase. They will undertake the early work, and then they'll pass it on to somebody who can concentrate all their energies on that one building.
So what will be your role in all this, Will?
Well, I'm a resident of the Isle of Sheppey, and I'm also a trustee of the Spitalfields Historic Buildings Trust, and I'm also going to be involved in the new Preservation Trust. So I've got my fingers in various pies, but the point is that I've sort of decided that the revival of this church is something which I want to see, and I'm absolutely determined to do everything I can to work with all the other bodies to bring that about. And I previously worked as the director of a charity called Save Britain's Heritage, which is a major national heritage preservation group. So I bring to this project my experience at Save, and also I think some good contacts and good people who can help with the project.
We are out and about at the moment. We're talking all about the Dockyard Church with Will Palin right here at BRFM. So we are out and about at the Sheerness Dockyard. We're talking to Will Palin all about the Dockyard Church. And well, I was wondering how much will actually be restored, and then what will it be used for?
That's a very good question. We've undertaken a major study into the restoration of the building, both in terms of the engineering and the architectural side of things, but also, of course, options for its reuse. The building had been earmarked for residential development. There were going to be 20 units in the church and a terrace of houses behind. As many of your listeners will know, the project never happened. It clearly wasn't viable, and the owner eventually lost his consent, and it was after that the council stepped in to compulsory purchase the building. We are looking at a mixed-use scheme. One of the key elements will be this spectacular model of the Dockyard, which was made in the 1820s, nearly 200 years ago, which is the largest architectural model of that period. It's about 40 foot square, and we'll talk about that. I think that you'll have some more questions on that for me, Daniel, but that'll be a key component, and we'll hope there'll be a permanent display place for the model in the church, probably on an upper level. where there'll also be some historical interpretation about the dockyard. So people can come here, look at the model, and hopefully look out of the back of the church over the dockyard itself and identify some of the buildings they're looking at in miniature in front of them. We also will have some kind of flexible community space in the church. I think that's very important. Quite what that is, we're yet totally to decide, and it's something that we need to consult with everybody on the island to decide what would be the best use. And also we want to include a number of business units, perhaps some small workshops, which will provide accommodation for small businesses in the island, which is very important, and will help to pay for the running of the upkeep of the building itself. These are just ideas at this stage, but I think the model is the key focus, and that we can build around it, hopefully, a successful series of other uses for the building.
Well, the model certainly sounds an important part. So I was wondering perhaps if you could tell our listeners a bit more about that.
Yeah, the model is one of these amazing objects. I mean, one of the things that has always surprised about the Isle of Sheppey is the extraordinary layers and the richness of the history here, and the spectacular architecture which is overlooked and not always appreciated. I think at last it is beginning to be recognised for its national importance. But the dockyard, when it was built, was a major government project, the largest of its time. And as I said, it cost over £1 million. There was a parliamentary investigation into the cost of the dockyard. It was a bit like the Millennium Dome of its time. The government overspent by something like 40%. But as part of the building of the dockyard itself, John Rennie, the brilliant engineer, the man who built the original London Bridge, he was the engineer for the dockyard and designed all the dry docks and the substructure and the timber piles that support all the buildings in the dockyard. He commissioned a model of the dockyard, it's a bit like a giant Hornby train set. Every element, every building is represented, and as well as all the timber piling below the surface of the ground. So it's an engineering model and an architectural model at the same time. It used to be on display in the boat store inside the dockyard, and it measures, as I said, about 40 foot square. It's beautifully detailed right down to the colours of the windows and the doors, and some of the buildings even have little fireplaces inside. And it currently sits in a storeroom in Gosport in Hampshire, and it's being looked after by English Heritage, who've also spent quite a lot of money restoring the model. So it's sitting on shelves at the moment, and our dream, our fantasy, is to bring it back to the island where it belongs and put it on public display so everyone here can enjoy it and see this remarkable object. And it is unique, there's no question.
I was just wondering, Will, as we finish up, is there any useful contact details where our listeners can perhaps find out more?
That's a very good question, Daniel. We've just sort of in the process of getting things started up, but perhaps this is a good opportunity for me to ask your listeners if there's anybody out there who could help in a voluntary basis in setting up a blog, a Facebook account, and helping us to tweet the news from the church. We would love to hear from anybody who could be interested in doing that, because at the moment we're in the very early stages of setting up our website and everything else. So if there's anybody out there who's got the skills, has got a bit of time, and is passionate about the heritage of the island, we'd love to hear from them.
Well, as always, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak to us, and especially to tell our listeners the progress of the Dockyard Church.
It's a pleasure, Daniel. Thank you.